I'm Carolyn Young, Chief Executive of Retail NZ. Welcome to today's episode. We will be discussing how to manage business changes within your team. Today, I'm joined by Yevgenya Chityan, who's our in-house business and HR advisor. Kia ora, Yev, and welcome.
Kia ora, thank you for having me.
So just prior to us starting, I just wanted to reiterate that we're not providing legal advice in this webinar and we're not lawyers. Yev is an HR expert with many years' experience in working through HR issues. If you're in doubt, we will give you advice to consult your lawyer. While all care is taken in giving this advice in the webinar today, what we're providing is of a general nature and is not intended to address any specific issues that you're working through in your organisation. If you do have a specific issue that you've got questions for us, please give Yev a call on 0800 472 472 and Yev will be able to provide you with specific advice to your situation. But Yev, tell us, time to time you take and receive calls from retailers who are looking to restructure or even close their businesses. Can you talk us through a little bit about, what is a business change process and how do you know if a formal process will be required?
So obviously business change is quite vague. It can really refer to anything from introducing a new policy to adding new products and services to restructuring a team or even closing down a portion of the business or the business entirely. So where a formal process is required, and that would be a formal consultation process, is where people's jobs are being impacted. That's basically any change to their terms and conditions of employment. So that could be the hours and days of work, could be their location, any changes to roles and responsibilities, and it has to be kind of a significant change. So rule of thumb is about 20% change to the role. That would be essentially triggering a formal process, and all the way through to jobs being disestablished where people are facing redundancies.
So the specificity of what a business is looking at is really critical in understanding what advice you're going to give them, I guess. How would a business determine whether you meet that 20% threshold for change?
It's a good question, and honestly, it's quite a difficult one to answer because it varies so much from business to business. So the employer really needs to carefully look at what are the differences in the responsibilities going to be, how much workload there is. For example, if in a role you have maybe a certain number of stakeholders that you work with and that stakeholder group is increasing or something like that. So the 20% can be quite difficult to calculate for sure. In some cases, what ends up happening is a role is actually, the changes are significant enough where that role can be considered as being disestablished and it's being replaced by a whole new role. So that's where definitely it's good to potentially either engage with a professional change management group or a consultant, or really do some very careful analysis, like a side-by-side comparison of those job descriptions, the previous and the proposed.
And that would give a sense of reasonableness around where that 20% would fall in place. So that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
So the business has to be able to kind of justify that significance if it's triggering like a redundancy.
And so if a business is looking at a change process, how would they communicate with their staff to ensure that there's, good transparency and everyone feels that they're consulted and are part of a process?
So a fair process basically requires really good communication all throughout, and everything's in writing. So you start first by putting together a business case. That's kind of the background of why this proposal is even happening. That includes oftentimes financial data that supports those proposed changes. And then when you actually start communicating to the employee, they are getting an invitation to a consultation meeting that's in writing. And that invitation has to specify that they may be facing a change to their role. There may be an impact to their role. They have to have in writing that they're entitled to a support person in that meeting. Then in that meeting, they need to get a document. We usually call it a consultation document or a proposal document that outlines why this change is being proposed, exactly what those changes are. And that could even be in some cases, a detailed kind of line by line breakdown of exactly which roles are changing, how they're changing. The written correspondence has to include all the steps of the process and the critical times and dates of when things are going to happen in the process. For example, after the consultation meeting happens, there has to be some time during which employees are able to give feedback on those proposed changes. So you have to be specific about when that feedback is due and how it needs to be provided back to the business. And then when you get into things like if there's going to be potential redundancies that come out of this business change, what that's going to look like in terms of what's the notice period, what's the potential payout, and if those employees who are facing redundancy, if they're going to be given options for redeployment or applying for other roles in the business, what does that look like? When is the selection happening? What's the selection criteria? Everything has to be really spelled out and in writing. And I think, in general, what the employer should really be aiming to do is minimize uncertainty as much as possible. There may be some information that's legally privileged, of course. So anything that the employer is able to share that might shed light on why is this happening and what employees can expect, that's going to really, make a big difference.
And look, I guess the key thing we can take out of that is really complex. There's a lot of things that are involved. You've got to take the time to sit down and plan. Obviously you can call Yev at any time and get some guidance around what are all of those steps and what needs to be included, and making sure that you go through that process really thoroughly. Because I guess one of the things that a lot of business owners and leaders really worry about are personal grievances. And,
Mm.
I guess a question for you, Yev, would be if a business is looking at or proposing that they're going to close permanently, can staff still file a grievance against a business in those sort of circumstances?
Absolutely. There's quite a few potential pitfalls here. So even if the business is closing permanently or transferring ownership, after that process is over, a personal grievance can still be filed against those former owners. And there's even under the Employment Relations Act provisions that sometimes lead to individuals within that business being personally held liable. So that would include the business owners or senior officers of the business, like people who have like a director role, depending on their level of involvement in that change process, they could be held personally liable. And those grievances can include unjustified dismissal. It can include things like hurt and humiliation. So, on top of, for example, back pay that may be due to the employee, there could be additional penalties on top of that. And they could go as high as like 20,000 or more in some cases.
Yeah, it's really challenging space to navigate, isn't it? And look, the thing about, there's always ways in HR in which disputes can occur, but what general advice could you provide to retailers around what support they could provide to staff during a transition period to minimise or reduce that risk of potential disputes down the track?
Yeah, so obviously, when there's a change, you can't really control how people respond, and people do respond very differently. So, change can be very, very distressing to people, especially when their livelihood is on the line. So, I think the very first thing is to, again, really try to make that communication as effective as possible, be clear, try to minimize certainty. I would say, don't drag it out too long either, because what also can happen is when there's a lot of time in between communications, for example, people start talking, people start speculating, and that can sometimes increase kind of those feelings of panic and uncertainty. And that leads to heightened emotions that can start impacting people's actions. So make sure the communication is really effective. Give people opportunities to ask questions, and maybe have additional meetings if they request one. Let them have their meetings so that they can potentially voice their concerns and things like that. Another one is if the business has EAP services available for their staff, push those include the information in every single piece of written documentation, bring it up in any conversation, make sure that they are well aware of how they can access those EAP services. If you don't have EAP services available to you, you can look into some different options. Just for example, we actually at Retail NZ have an EAP provider that we partner with, which is Workplace Support, and they offer services at a discount to members of Retail NZ. There are potentially other options out there as well for EAP services that are not, based on an annual prescription, but maybe as and when required. So I really recommend that. There's also other services that may be available to employers that offer additional support. So just for example, Work and Income has redundancy support for employers where they can offer training or support to those employees who are facing redundancy with upskilling themselves, help assistance with their CV, or even assistance with finding them jobs. There's some NGOs out there that also offer that type of support. Like I'm actually familiar with one in Auckland specifically called Upskills that offers training to workers at no cost, and that can be around things like financial literacy, basic workplace numeracy and literacy, and basic computer skills, things that can really help those workers find new jobs faster.
Yeah, that's really great. And look, I think the thing to remember about the relationship with workplace support is any retailer that's a member of Retail NZ can access those services for their employees. You don't pay the annual fee, you just pay per usage for each session that's held. So it does mean that you can access really quality support for your staff, and the offer is out there. I guess what I've really heard from you today is that change is difficult. It's challenging for both the retailer and for the employees. Laying everything out as clearly as possible, keeping some cadence of momentum around moving forward with the change process, but offering great opportunities for consultation with staff is really critically important to minimise those risks of disputes and grievances down the line. Can always happen. You can't control everything, but actually if you run a really good process, if you're really compassionate and empathetic, and you don't drag it out too long so that the stress is not too much for staff, then often you can go through those processes as smoothly as you're able to, because they are really stressful for everyone. Look, yeah, thank you so much for giving us those really top level points. And I know that you've had lots of inquiries through our advice line. If you are thinking about doing a change process or looking at restructure due to some changes in your business, please get in touch with Yev via our 0800 number, 0800 472 472. Or you can email Yev on advice@retail.kiwi, and we're really happy to talk you through the steps that you need to go through and to oversee some of the documentation that you need to pull together. Thank you so much for joining us today, Yev. It's really such a pleasure to speak to you and hear about the recommendations that you've got on looking at restructuring and closing businesses for retailers.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Special thanks to Retail NZ partners whose support enables us to keep you up to date with everything retail. I hope you enjoyed this episode. You had a good quick break and enjoyed your coffee. Finally, don't forget to subscribe so you can keep up to date with all the current industry knowledge. But until next time, ka kite anō. Bye for now. Kia ora.